Hey, welcome to Rob Paints Models. In today's video I'm going to be showing you how to paint 3 different kinds of black and 1 different kind of white. These are usually troublesome colours, so let's get on with it. Now I'm going to start out by painting the robes of Sister Amalia Novena here. As you can see, I'm doing a cream interior, so I'm just going to paint that first because it's a bit easier to do that. So we're going to base coat it with Steel Legion Drab. This will take about 2 or 3 thin coats to apply smoothly. This is just to give us something a bit easier to work on top of rather than just black. So once you've got a nice smooth coat of Steel Legion Drab laid down, we're going to start painting in some layers of Karak stone. And this is quite thin down. You can see it's actually separated a bit on my wet palette because this from the night before. But just make sure you don't have too much paint on your brush, and just do a few downstrokes. This is almost thin enough to be a glaze, but it's not quite translucent enough. We're just really building up to a good layer of this. So again, this will take about 3 coats to actually get to an opaque layer. We just want to leave a little bit of the Steel Legion Drab in the very darkest areas where we can't really reach and you probably won't be able to see. Make sure each coat dries fully before applying the next one, because with these paints the pigment can be quite thick and can build up quite quickly on these pale colours from GW. So this can lead to lots of texture if you don't let it dry fully. As long as you let it dry fully, it should be okay. Now we're going to use some Flayed One Flesh, and we're just going to paint this into the very bottom part of the robes here. Again, just layering this down into my brightest areas. Being relatively rough to start with, but again, making sure each layer is fully dry before applying the next one. Now I'm mixing in a little bit of white to my Flayed One Flesh. A little bit of white in there, just to give us a little bit of a brighter highlight. I'm just kind of blending that using the Flayed One Flesh. Keep getting those mixed up. It's already on the model, so I'm just doing a little bit of a wet blend from my white and Flayed One Flesh into Flayed One Flesh. And I'm taking that highlight colour all the way up the side of the cloth as well. I never quite go to pure white on the inside of the robes here, because I want to maintain that warm tone to make it look like it's a bit of a ivory colour rather than an actual white. So this is not our first shade of white, although it is pretty close. If you want a really warm white, then this is a good way to go with it. Just take it up slightly closer to white ones for the final highlights. So as you can see here, the trick here is with these pale colours is lots of very thin coats and let them dry between them. So now we're going to go straight into our first shade of black, and this is going to be a kind of a cool black. I'm using Incubi Darkness. This is thinned with water so that it's a quite translucent consistency. And I'm just painting this on the areas where I want the reflections to be. Now we're going for quite a shiny kind of satin-like finish here on these robes, on the outer part of these robes anyway. So I just want this where the reflections are going to be, and I'm not worrying about the light and shadow aspect of this. The cloth is going to be black in its darkest areas, so we're just only going to paint where it's lighter, and that's only going to be where the reflections are being cast. So now I'm going to use a little bit of Dark Reaper, and I'm actually going to mix this 50-50 with my Incubi Darkness and start blocking in some highlights. Now the Incubi Darkness is so thin it's actually almost black anyway, but it just gives us a little bit of a slightly colder colour and makes the black look a bit of a cold black to start with. So as you can see here, I'm just painting in that 50-50 mix down towards the bottom of the robe there, catching where the highlight's going to be, checking with my own light source to make sure that I'm getting the highlights in the right place, and also checking against reference images that I took before I painted the model. Now I'm going to take some titanium white and I'm going to mix this into my colour to create a much lighter tone. This is still quite thin, but I'm only using the very tip of the brush just to get those really bright, sharp highlights. And this is one of the biggest tricks of making something look shiny, is you've got to have a big swing from dark to light. It's got to do that transition over a very short distance, and that's why I've not built up to this. I'm basically just going straight in with a light colour, painting it in a very small area, and that's going to give us our glossy looking effect. Now once you've got this blocked in, we're going to go back in with some glazes and we're just going to blend this back in, smooth out the blend a little bit, and just make this appear a bit darker. So here we go, the glaze of Incubi Darkness. And I'm just glazing this from the lightest areas into the darkest areas, and I'm just changing it through the different parts of my colour there. So I'm using a little bit of Dark Reaper here glaze. And these are very thin, very translucent, and it will take a few of these to really get the blend nice and smooth. But they're so thin that they dry really fast. And you'll see the transition build up quite quickly. You can also use this opportunity to tidy up any of the highlights that you may have smudged or gotten in the wrong places. Make them look a bit thinner, a little bit sharper. And I'm actually going in here with just some Abaddon Black, just thinned down to a glaze consistency, to make sure I get it right into the deepest, darkest areas, and just underneath all of those little buttons there. So now onto our second kind of black for the corset. I'm doing a warm, soft black for this one. So over our Abaddon Black, I'm just blocking in some Skaven Blight Dinge where I want the highlights to be. Now this is more about light and shadow than it is about reflections. I want the corset to be made of a soft, non-reflective material, so it's scattering the light a lot, which also means it's actually going to be closer to grey than it is to black, but we still want its very darkest areas, its very recesses, to be black. So you can see here I'm catching the bottom part of the corset where it flares out over the waist. I'm also getting it underneath the breasts there, just because that looks like it should catch and reflect a bit more light than the area in the waist. It will also give it the appearance of cinching in the waist more. I mean, you can't cinch in power armor, but for some reason they're wearing corsets, and so I'm going to paint them like a corset. So now I'm going to layer in some Storm Vermin fur. I'm just taking this down about halfway down where I did the Skaven Blight Dinge, and then I'm also going to pick out some edge highlights with this as well. Mostly the vertical lines of paneling on the corset and the trim around the edges. I'm also going to pick out all of the studs with this as well. I'm not painting those into a metallic. I'm just painting those as if they're kind of cloth covered. And I'm being relatively rough with this, and there's a reason for that. I'm not worrying too much about my blends at this point, because we're going to cover it all in a wash. So you can see that looks pretty good. And I'm going to take some Baneblade Brown, and we're just going to use this for our very kind of brightest highlights here, which is mostly going to be on the trim and underwire and just down the edges of the panels there. I'm not really painting this into the flat surfaces, just the edges. As you can see, I'm using the very tip of my brush and making sure that if it does dry out too fast, just go back and get more paint, because there's no point trying to paint with a dried out brush. So now I'm using Army Painter Quick Shade Dark Tone here. You could use Nuln Oil as well. I find this gives a deeper, darker black and sits better on the recesses and stays where it's put because it's a bit thicker. But it does recede from the surfaces quite nicely. As you can see, I'm just slopping this all over the corset. I'm also going to apply a little bit onto the recesses of the robes as well. It does dry a little bit glossy, but you can tone that down with some matte varnish at the end. Make sure to pull it out of any recesses where you don't want it to pool too much. And when it's dry, it looks like this. You can see it smoothed out those blends, all those layers on the corset quite nicely. and given us our soft, warm black colour. Now I'm going to be showing you how to paint a hard surface in black, so we're going to be using the bolter for this. And I'm going to be starting by base coating it all with a Baden black. I'm only going to be using painting the casing black, the rest of it's going to be metallics. And I'm only going to be using two paints for this, a Baden black and Ultron grey. So start off with a mix of a Baden black and Ultron grey. This is just basically a tiny tip of Ultron grey into my Baden black, just to create a slightly off black tone. I think this is probably quite close to Reaper's Coal Black, if you have that. Or I think Corvus Black as well, which I think is a new one that GW have. I don't have it, so I don't really know. And then I'm going in, I'm creating a relatively bright tone with my Ultron Grey and my Baden Black. And I'm just painting this in where all my brightest spots are going to be. Again, I'm just roughing this in, and then I will fix the blends afterwards. So you can see how I'm going in with some glazes of my darker off-black tone. And I'm just fixing up those blends, making the bright spots a bit smaller, and glazing from the lightest parts into the darkest parts of the model. As you can see here, these glazes are very thin and they dry very quickly, so you can get through this process quite fast. But if it is taking a little bit longer, feel free to mix another tone and use that. You don't have to sit and glaze 50 layers in order to be able to smooth out your blends. If mixing another colour will actually get you there. Like I said, I'm only using two paints to do this entire black effect on this bolter here. And I'll also use this method for painting the grenades, but they're so small that it was really very difficult to show you how to paint those on camera. So you can see that I'm using an intermediate tone that I've mixed, just to speed up the glazing process. And I'm going in with some Ultron Grey, making sure there's not too much on my brush. And I'm using this to edge highlight the bolt gun casing. Now I start off originally only doing the top surfaces that are going to catch the light, but then eventually I decide to go back and do all of the edges on the bolt gun casing, because it actually kind of looked a little bit better. I needed to really reinforce those highlights along the bottom edge of the bolt gun. And again, you can go back and fix these quite easily with the paints that are on your palette if you make any mistakes. Make sure to catch the shell ejection port, don't forget that. You can see how I'm just going in with some black paint, thinned down to fix up my edge highlights there that are along the top, and I'll use a slightly off black colour to fix the edge highlights along the bottom. Now back with the old titanium white, we're going to use this to do some corner highlights, or also make some little chips and dings in the surface of the bolter, because it's a hard surface and it will get scratched. I'm just using this to reinforce my edge highlights, make them a little bit brighter, a little bit more reflective. I like to think that the first edge highlight is actually a depiction of the paint job on the bolter casing wearing down and being damaged, and the bright second highlight is actually the reflections that are occurring from the light source. So now I'm going back in with some thinned black paint here, and I'm just tidying up all of my edges and all of the gaps that are in the bolt gun casing. I don't want to use a wash over this if I can help it. It would be much better to use the tip of my brush and paint carefully into the panel lines. So now I'm going to show you how I do the metallics, and I do this for all of the silver metallics across the entire model. So I use some exhaust manifold, which is a really good colour. The trick with this is that you don't want to have very much on your paintbrush. You can see that I've barely got any on my brush there. If your point of your brush is not a very precise tip, then you've got too much of this paint on your brush. Also, if you leave it on your wet palette for too long, it does tend to go weird, so you want to work with it relatively quickly. And I'm just using this to base coat all of my metallic parts. I'm leaving a black line along all of the edges where two metallic parts meet. This is why I'm being so precise here. You could go back in afterwards with a wash and apply that if you wanted to. But I just find it's a little bit easier for me to actually just use the tip of my brush, be precise, and put that black line in just by not painting anything there. These paints are very cool in that if you paint more than one coat of them, they get shinier, but the brightness of the colour doesn't really change. So exhaust manifold, it doesn't really change the colour of the metallic paint, but it does make it more uniformly shiny, so you get less of the effects of the metal flakes that's in the paint appearing through if you do two coats rather than just one. So now I'm going to edge highlight that with VMA Chrome. I could have done multiple edge highlights with different colours here, but I'm deciding to just go straight to Chrome, which is what I usually use for my brightest colours. That's because this bolt gun is made up almost entirely of just hard edges and bright hard lines, rather than having any curves on it. When it comes to the barrel, I'm just catching basically the top part of the barrel with my chrome there, rather than going all the way around it. Just trying to catch the areas where the light would be reflecting off it a bit stronger. Now I'm showing you this. You don't have to do this, you can, and you don't have to use the paints I'm using. You can do this any way you want. But I'm painting that little button that's above her thumb there. I'm assuming that's the safety. So I'm starting off, I'm painting that with some ultramarine grey, just to give us a base coat to work off. And I'm using VMA fluorescent red here, but you can use any colour. I just thought it'd be fun to try out a fluorescent paint on this little button here. And it actually looks more orange than it looks red. And it takes about 3 or 4 coats, even on this tiny area, to actually build up into a nice bright opaque colour, even over the white. This would have taken forever over black. And that's pretty much all I'm doing. I'm just leaving it as a fluorescent red dot on that button there. But you could use red paint, you could use orange, just do what you want, but picking up that button really adds a nice little detail and a little splash of colour on the bolter. So now I'm painting the icons that are on the bolt gun, and this is the same method I use for all of the gold on the model. This is Vallejo Metal Color Gold. And again, like the exhaust manifold, you don't want very much on this on your brush. As you can see, it covers really well with barely any on my brush at all. And you want to do 2 coats preferably in order to build up the shine. Otherwise it will look a little bit flaky, but after 2 coats it should be fine. And if you make any mistakes, just go around it with some black paint. Now I'm using some of my dark tone, and I am applying this over all of the gold areas, and some of the metal areas. I decided to apply this over the gold areas mostly because I wanted to create hard delineation between the different sections of the gold. This Army Painter dark tone goes into recesses and doesn't really stain the top surface very much, which is great for creating actual recess shade. So that's why I'm using it there. Null Oil Gloss will also have the same effect. So here I've assembled the rest of the model, and as you can see I painted the rosaries in the same metal colours as everything else. These purity seals, that's just Screamer Pink highlighted up with some adding white at each stage. The purity seals are the same colours as the inside of the robes there. And this belt, this is just XV88 washed with Agrax Earthshade and Reichland Flesh Shade, and then highlighted with a bit of white added into it. Very simple. I've also glazed some of the gold with a little bit of Lamenter's Yellow just to give it a little bit more warmth. So I'm going to show you how I paint a cold white hard material. I'm going to start off by base coating in all of the white areas with Mechanica Standard Grey. I'm going to leave a small black line around these details, just so they sit very, very proud of the surrounding red shoulder plate, and also so that I don't actually have to apply a wash to them afterwards in order to be able to cause them to be distinct. Yes, Mechanica Standard Grey is pretty good because it actually usually covers in one coat. And because you're going to be putting another layer over the top of it, you don't actually have to worry about having full coverage, as long as it's not black. So again, I'm being kind of careful, just making sure I'm not going to get any paint on the rest of the model here, more than I'm actually worried about leaving gaps between the different sections. As you can see, I'm actually just going to paint over the entire icon with Mechanica Standard Grey, because the colour that I want in the gaps on this is actually grey, because these are solid pieces, like these would have been moulded or cast out of one piece of material, as opposed to different armor plates that might be sliding over each other or different pieces of metal. These guys would actually be probably one piece, so they've been painted, so it would actually have grey in the gaps rather than black, because it's not an absence of light, it actually is just looking into a gap that's lighter. So now I'm making a mid-tone from Mechanica Standard Grey and Ultron Grey. This is about 1-to-1 mix. This is quite thinned down, just so I can get a few layers going. And very carefully with the tip of my brush, I'm just using this to paint in all of the feathers on the icons, and I'm leaving some of that Mechanica Standard Grey in the deepest recesses. This is pretty precise work and does take a lot of practice to be able to do this. But this is how I paint these kinds of icons. It's also how I paint Aquillas on Space Marines. It means that I don't have to do a wash step at the end in order to create definition. I'm just building up the definition one feather at a time, essentially. And it doesn't take me much longer than painting them and then applying a wash. So now I'm using some thinned down Ultron Grey, and again, just building up those colours. On the big eye on the shoulder icon there, I'm just doing it straight Ultron Grey, and I will highlight it up to white later. Then using the tip of my brush to catch the top of that wing, which is pretty tricky. But then also using the tip of my brush to highlight the very edges and the ends of the wings again with that Ultron Grey. So you can see here, just using the very, very tip. This is where it's important to have a good tip on your brush. If you don't have a good tip on your brush, you won't be able to do this. And again, just leaving a little bit of the previous layers of colour visible. So I've gone around and I've done that on all of the rest of the shoulder icons there. It's exactly the same method for the other half of the eagle, the wings, and the fleur-de-lis that's on the other shoulder there. It's exactly the same method as you saw me paint before. And now I'm using, again, some titanium white. And this is relatively thin out of the tube. It's very thick, but you want to add a bit of water to it until it's thinned down so it moves. And I'm just using this to do my final highlights on these white areas. Mostly just concentrating it on the surfaces that are pointing towards the light source, which is right above us, or the very, very points of the feathers on the wings. This will usually dry a lot more transparent than it looks when it's going on, so you might want to do 2 or 3 coats of it. And again, you can see on the fleur-de-lis, I'm just catching the areas that are pointing towards our light source. And that's it. And I don't want super high contrast on those white details because, as I said, there's not gaps between those sections. They are something someone has painted white and then attached to the armor, in my mind, rather than something that has dark gaps where there would be an absence of light between the sections. And that's the final model. Thank you to all my patrons for making this video possible. I hope you enjoyed it. The next step in this will be painting the face, which will be getting its own video and should be going up relatively soon, hopefully. So, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed that. Bye.